Finally, I want to let you know that the Institute regularly records our conferences. That is the case tonight. You can find all of our recordings on our YouTube channel, which I invite you to subscribe to, so that if you've missed anything tonight, you can always go back and look at it on our YouTube channel. I would like to take this occasion to ask you to make sure that you have your mobile phones on silent mode so as not to interfere with the recording or interrupt the speaker. And I would like to assure you that you will have an opportunity to have questions at the end of the conference. We'll pass the microphone around so that we can include the questions in the recording during the question and answer session. So tonight, getting to the heart of the subject, we welcome a special friend of the Institute, who many of you know already, François Huber, who is an engineer, a business expert. He has been the president and director of several innovative companies, including ChemiWatt, specialist in energy storage, Blue H, specialist in the development of floating wind farms, and he is an international consultant, the CEO of Mobilis Consulting here in Rennes. François has been on the cutting edge of business development, and his insights combine the technical experience and his keen analysis of international relations within the business environment. And this has intrigued our audiences and many others for a number of years. The last time he spoke at the Institute was during the COVID pandemic. He was our very first virtual speaker in December of 2020 when he talked to us about the surprisingly perennially strong US economy. Tonight, we are delighted to welcome him back for this conference tonight, an insight into American business narratives. Thank you very much, François. And so without further ado, I'll pass the mic to François.
Okay, good evening, everyone. Thanks for coming. Again, best wishes for 2024. So I'm gonna stay here for most of the conference because we want the video to make sense. So this evening, American business narratives. So as you can see, it starts with a picture of a game you might have played with occasionally. I didn't think much of this originally. I thought the picture would be interesting and would introduce the topic, but actually when you know the history of the game, it is really interesting. The game was created by a social activist who wanted to demonstrate that if you use the taxation system of an economist called Henry George, you could actually prevent the creation of monopolies. And so originally the game had two sets of rules, one that you're familiar with, and the other one where you use the taxation system of Henry George, and where you can't win, right? And so, of course, in the U.S., I mean, social activism is very fine, but after a few years, a company bought the rights of the game for a handful of dollars, and then very quickly the set of rules became the one you're familiar with, and there is a winner, right? There is a winner, and there is a monopoly, and the taxation system of Henry George is still pretty much academic and theoretical, even though by many accounts there's no reason why we couldn't use it, but do we want to use it? So why did I want to talk about American business narratives? Maybe I'm going to let Daniel Kahneman say a word about that. So I don't know if any of you have read this incredible book of Daniel Kahneman, a book describing the works for which he got a Nobel Prize in economics. So when I read the book, I just came across this sentence, and I thought it captures really everything. So the word makes much less sense than you think. The coherence comes mostly from the way your mind works. So what he's saying, and I'm going to explain that a little bit further later on, you don't really analyze the whole thing. When you confront it to business and you try to understand what's going on, pretty much you use a story. You don't use your mind to analyze the things. You think, okay, it works this way, and if it seems to be working this way, it's just fine. And so, in a nutshell, I spoil a little bit what I'm going to talk about, but business is extremely messy. It's messy and complex and complicated, and we don't understand anything, right? Or we don't understand much. We understand a lot of things, but we don't understand much on a daily basis. And so we don't like not to understand. And so we're looking for that coherence, because otherwise we're uncomfortable. And so there's a good story that tells us, okay, this is how it works. Even if when you're digging a little bit into it, you're not sure it really works the way you think it does, well, we just take it, because it makes life more comfortable. And so that leads to a number of issues that we're going to discuss today. So what are we going to cover? First, we're going to talk about the reason why stories matter, basically what I just explained, but I'll go into some details. Then we're going to look at what kind of narratives we are coming across when we're talking about business, or the American views about business. Then we're going to challenge them. We're going to try and really think, okay, does this really make sense? Is it really what it seems to be? And then we'll go a little bit beyond that and think, okay, so these narratives, are they really universal? And very often we think it's universal. We think, okay, the Americans have explained it, but there's an underlying truth that this is how business works. Or is it more like an American story, and we don't really have access to the ultimate truth, right? And so, as you can imagine, I'm not necessarily going to provide definite answer about that, but maybe a few interesting things. So why do stories matter, first of all? They matter because we're designed to believe in them. Right? So how does it work? What Daniel Kahneman has discovered or explained or worked on and been rewarded for is that we have two systems when we're making decisions or when we're trying to understand the world around us. One that he calls system one is basically intuition. It's automatic thinking. And so, for instance, when I enter the room and you look at me, immediately your brain says, I like this guy or I don't like this guy, right? And so you didn't ask any question. Your brain just gives you information. So your brain has learned to analyze people over the years and has statistics about that. So here, I take this example because, of course, it doesn't make any sense. You can't know whether you like or don't like someone just by looking at them, but your brain thinks it does, right? So that's the problem with intuition. Intuition can be extremely interesting because it gives you an answer immediately. You don't have to think. You don't have to work about it, right? But that answer can be complete nonsense. So if you really know what you're talking about, for instance, if you've been working a long time on something that is, for instance, scientific or technical, then your intuition can be right because you really know what you're talking about. But if it's something that cannot be predicted, like the lottery, right? So you've been following the lottery for a long time and you think you know the next numbers. Well, maybe you do, but of course you don't, right? But you have the feeling that you do. So that's the problem with intuition. And so the important thing here is that we want to have the answers the last thing we want is to be in a situation where we don't really know what's going on. We want to know what's going on. And so if our brain says, this is how it works, of course we want to believe it. It's very difficult to think, oh, wait a second, maybe, so there's another option, of course. The other option is the system 2. And so I gave a picture of chess, but chess is actually also something that can be done with system 1. Usually I use a picture of someone doing mathematics on a blackboard. System 2 is your conscious reasoning. Conscious reasoning is hard. It's difficult, right? That's the problem with conscious reasoning. Conscious reasoning is the Rolls Royce of thinking on this planet. We are literally the smartest animals on Earth because we have that. However, we hate to use it because conscious reasoning is hard. When you look at these people playing chess, you're thinking, oh, wow, why don't I go to to the kitchen and have a drink instead, right? Because you don't want to do that, right? You don't want to sit down and think hard about something. Just like you don't want to walk up the stairs, right? Your body tells you, no, don't walk up the stairs. Take the lift, right? Or just sit down in the couch. So here it's the same thing. Conscious reasoning is extremely, extremely powerful. But if we can avoid to use it, we will, right? Because it's resource hungry. It's difficult. Our brain, our body doesn't like it. So we're lazy with this. And so what is our shortcut? What is the thing we can do to avoid this? Well, obviously, it's to go to system 1, right? So that's what we do most of the time. If you think of it, so I'll give you an example later on to understand this. But before I get to that, I wanted to show you something else that come from another Nobel Prize in economics called Robert Shiller, who's written another extraordinary book called Narrative Economics. So what he's doing is using Google Ngrams, and he's looking at how many searches you have for a given phrase. And so here, for instance, comparing labor-saving machinery to technological unemployment, and you see some correlations. Why do you have correlations? Because people read something about this, for instance, and they're interested in it. When they see, oh wow, there's labor-saving machinery now, and it's getting more and more available, and so we're talking about robots, or we're talking about AI, this kind of things, then people automatically use a story that's been going on for decades, which is okay, but if you can save time with machines, then people will get out of jobs, right? It never happened. Economically, it doesn't really make sense. So it's probably never going to happen, right? I should probably, right? I didn't say never. But people like this story. It makes sense at first glance. You're thinking, okay, if machines do more work, people do less work, right? Well, that's not what happens. Actually, we do more work. Everybody does more work, and we consume more, and we ruin the planet. That's what happens. But people still think it's it's a zero-sum game, and so if they win, you lose, right? So what Robert Shiller explains in his book is that economics are not chemistry or physics. When we look at economics, there is not a hard truth. It's still open to interpretation. It's still open to debates and so on. And so people have opinions. They have emotions. It's not like A plus 2 plus 2 is 4. Even though in economics it should be part of it. So now if we go to business and we understand this, right? So really we work with stories, and collectively these stories become narratives that we discuss together and that we end up implementing, right? We make decisions in business, we make decisions in boardrooms, in meetings, that are based on stories that we share, stories that are around, the things we read in the newspapers and we hear on TV. So the problem is business is more complex than these stories. So for instance, when I ask the question, why do innovative companies go global, right? If I ask you, why do innovative companies go global? And so I'm looking at a couple of people involved in business, and what is the answer to that? So usually if I ask people in the room, I get this kind of answer. If companies create innovative products, then it means people will like it here, and people will also like it in other countries. There's no reason. So that's the reason why you're going global, because you can sell it abroad. So why wouldn't you, right? Actually, if you're familiar with business strategy, there's another driver, there's another reason, which is much more compelling. It's the idea that if you're doing business in Brittany here, and you're innovating, there is a cost of generating this innovation. And so when you sell it, a big proportion of the turnover, of the money you're going to make, is going to be used to generate this innovation, right? You're going to pay to repay a loan that you took, if you want, to generate this innovation. So obviously, if you can sell it worldwide, the proportion of innovation in your turnover, the money you've invested, is going to be distributed in a much larger market. So in other words, you're going to be much more competitive, right? You're going to make more money with the same investment at the beginning, right? This is why companies need to go abroad, because they need to distribute the costs. They're looking for economies of scale, basically. So a little more complex than that, but that's the general idea. But you don't have access to this in your system one. That's not a story, right? Some of you are frowning right now because they're thinking, okay, what is he explaining? Come again? What proportion of what? This requires system two, conscious reasoning, to get into play, right? So I can't just say that on TV and people say, oh yeah, sure, right? But I can say this and people say, yeah, sure, right? So it's much easier to believe that story than to understand this. And business is a lot about that. So now, if you think of the opinion you have on business, probably a lot of it are stories. They're not this. So stories are not always wrong, but it still suggests that we probably need to challenge these stories and try to scratch a little bit deeper to see what we do have. And so let's look at the stories then. Let's look at what we have. So the classic American business narratives, you're going to see things, maybe some of you were expecting, oh, okay, it's going to be super complex and so on, but this is probably going to be very familiar for all of us. The first one, of course, is the self-made man, right? And it's really a self-made man. It's very infrequent that it's a self-made woman. So the archetypal character here is Uncle Scrooge of Walt Disney. So the richest duck on earth, and so started in the Klondike during the gold rush in the 19th century and so on. So this is Uncle Scrooge, and so this is a story, of course, but based on characters that some of you might be familiar with. So Andrew Carnegie. Andrew Carnegie, that was the steel magnate in the U.S. in the 19th century. And then we can think of other characters that maybe are more familiar for you. So people like this guy, maybe you've heard about that guy or seen him on TV a couple of times. So Donald J. Trump. We have this young kid, maybe a little older now. So Bill Gates. And here we have a newcomer, Elon Musk, that again, maybe some of you have heard about. So that's these people really embody the concept of the self-made man, right? Everybody is thinking, wow, they created their fortunes all by themselves because they're probably incredible people and so on. So, okay, we'll discuss that. We'll see. So, just a couple of other examples that I don't know. Everybody loves to see. So, rags to riches. Maybe you know this woman, Oprah Winfrey. So she used to be a very poor little girl in Mississippi, one of the poorer states in the United States, and so on. So black, with no, really starting from the very bottom of the ladder, and now she's who she is. So famous, so rich, so successful, and I don't know her personally, but she seems to be an absolutely wonderful person. So. Of course, you understand here. I'm spoiling a little bit, but is it too good to be true, or so it's the stories we would love to believe, right? It's such a perfect story. We have the pioneer, so Jeff Bezos creating Amazon at a time when the internet barely existed, and apparently he understood things that nobody else understood, and so on. So. With hindsight, when we're looking at him right now, we think, wow, how can it be, how is it possible to be so smart when nobody has any idea what internet would become, right? Well, I'll say a word about this. And then you have the I don't know, textbook genius, the guy that takes an ailing tech company and turns it into the first $1 trillion company. So the guy who turns literally silicon into gold. That's an amazing person. Whether you believe in stories or not, of course, right? All these people are amazing. That's a fact. Now. That's not my point. My point is the story we use to understand their career. Are these stories credible? Do they make sense, right? And that's another thing. But of course, I'm not saying these people are just ordinary people, right? I don't think they're ordinary people. So one of the other stories you have in business is that business is for business, right? And government is for other things. And so that's not necessarily something we believe outside the United States, but in the United States, it's very clear, right? So business is about business. The government deals with other things. In one of the other conferences I gave here, I also explained that, for instance, helping people is not a government thing in the U.S. In France, when you see homeless people, you think it's the job of the government to help them, right? And we pay taxes for that. In the U.S., the idea that you're going to pay taxes for some people in Washington to deal with the homeless people that are right in front of me, no, that doesn't make any sense. You help the people, and the government takes care of federal business, right? And that's it. So that's a different approach. And so you understand when you look at this picture of Lehman Brothers and people carrying boxes with their personal belongings. Here you have the Treasury Secretary in 2008, Henry Paulson, saying, I never once considered that it was appropriate to put taxpayers' money on the line to save Lehman Brothers. So what happened is Lehman Brothers was in really big difficulty and jeopardy at that time, and this was the I don't know, the tip of the iceberg of the banking system, and a number of people were saying if you don't solve Lehman Brothers' problems, the whole banking system could collapse. And the argument of Henry Paulson is, well, yeah, but it's not my business, right? I'm not in charge of the American banking system, which is, if you know a little bit about the history of central bankers and so on, in the 19th century, the people who saved the American banking system and the American economy in one of the last crises at the end of the 19th century was J.P. Morgan. So one of the colleagues of Carnegie, right, a guy who was extremely rich, and he single-handedly solved the crisis by taking care of the issues as an individual, a private individual, because there was no central federal banking system. And that led to the creation, actually, later on of a banking system, a federal banking system. So another thing is the extra mile. And I'm sure the Americans in the room understand this concept very well. Some of you maybe know that I'm a Green Bay Packers fan. I watch American football very often, and I'm always trying to skip the annoying commercials for trucks and stuff like that, and where they explain, well, we don't know about firemen who do 90% of a job, or people working in their restaurant doing only 90% of a job. So our trucks are doing 150% of a job. So it's something like this. So there's always this question of the extra mile. And while I'm talking about football, of course, I want to give the mic to Vince Lombardi. The Super Bowl trophy is called the Vince Lombardi Trophy. So this is a legendary football coach of the Green Bay Packers. And so he said the dictionary is the only place where success comes before work, right? So this, couldn't be more American, right? So there is this thing that in business you will succeed because of hard work, right? And that's it. And so it's a narrative that you hear repeatedly and sometimes in contexts where it seems outlandish, but it's so ingrained in the American psychic that it's constantly coming back. Then you have a number of things that are easy. So I say the moon shot, but now we can say the sun shot or the Mars shot or whatever it is. The moon is really a neighboring piece of rock for us now. So here you have the Tesla Roadster that Elon Musk has sent to space with SpaceX, right? So this is not it's a real picture, right? You need to understand that. So he did this. And so this idea that in business, if you have to aim for the moon, right? You have to be ambitious, and that will provide business opportunities, right? Outstanding business opportunities. There are other versions of this, like high risk, high reward, these kind of things. So here I have an expert at this, Elizabeth Holmes. So some of you maybe are aware of the story of Elizabeth Holmes. I'll get back to that a little later. So she founded a startup called Theranos. And she said at a relatively early age, I began to believe that building a business was perhaps the greatest opportunity for making an impact, because it's a tool for making a change in the world, right? So if you're born in Sweden and you want to save the planet, well, you stage a protest and you Greta Thunberg. If you're in the U.S., you create a startup, you raise $1 billion, and you go B Corp or these kind of things. So that's something that probably, a number of people in France want to create a business to get a unicorn, a startup that has a very high value, and because they want to sell it and get rich, and that's it. So in the US, you also have a lot of people doing that. But the idea of accomplishing something through business is much, much more developed. Right? And in Europe, a lot of people want to do things with business, but they don't necessarily think, I'm going to change the world. In the US, yes, you think, okay, I'm creating this, and I'm going to change the world because business is the right way or the convenient way to change the world. So one of the strategies you have if you're if you're doing this kind of things, is flyer crash. So flyer crash is the idea that, okay, you have a great idea. We don't know if it's going to work. So here's $10 million, not 100,000 or 1.5 million, 10 million or 20 or 50 if you need 50 or more, right? And then go for it. Go for it 150%. And then if in 1 year you've made it, fantastic. If you crash, well, next, right? and that's what they do. That's what they really do. One of my friends who's working in an American startup told me last month we got a beating by the board because we did not spend enough, right? You need to spend, right? Because if you don't spend, it means you're not working fast or hard enough. And so they started buying plenty of stuff just to show that they were doing something, right? So it's a bit crazy, but it's the reality. It's a true story. I could give you the name of the person and the company. It really happened. And it's about millions of dollars, right? We're not talking about 10,000 or something. One of the other things is thinking out of the box. And so at one point, if we're talking about business, I have to let this guy say something because everything in strategy and business has been written in the 80s and 90s by this guy. Everything that you hear in business school is about Michael Porter. And so he said, strategy is not a matter of being better at what you do, it's a matter of being different at what you do. So there's a thing that you have to be absolutely innovative, different. You have to do something that other people have not done before in order to develop your business. And so typically I don't know, the story, actually. It's a sort of theory, but it's a story. It's a new way to say something that's been around forever in business. It's called the blue ocean, right? So here you have the red ocean where all the competitors, it's a mature industry, so all the competitors the fish are biting each other, right? And so it's red with blood. And so what you want to do is to jump in another area where there is no competition. You want to create your own market. Right? So typically Apple with the iPhone, these kind of things. So that's a story that, again, who would challenge this story? Simple, clear, right? So it sounds a lot like that. Business seems to be only about this. Listen to Michael Porter, be different, create your blue ocean, and you'll be fine, right? Okay. So let's look at it then. So again, I'm not going to challenge like for the sake of challenging. I just want to give you another perspective and remind you of realities that maybe at times do not chime so well with the stories we're so familiar with. Right? I'm not sure you're very surprised by what I've told you so far. Right? Maybe a lot of these stories are just so familiar, right? Who doesn't know Uncle Scrooge and so on? So storytelling is not necessarily wrong, right? It's just a way of explaining the reality. Storytelling doesn't mean lying. Storytelling just means, okay, explain the things so we can understand them. And a story is a great way to do that. So one day I was in San Francisco with my startup, and I had a couple of courses about how to pitch in the U.S. And again, nobody was telling us lie and how to deceive investors or anything. Nobody was even suggesting that. But they were saying, okay, if you introduce something that people are familiar with, if you play with their emotions and so on, so they get into what you're saying, they stay focused, and then you can bring this and so on. It's just a technique, right? So storytelling is not necessarily wrong, but what I challenge is it possible to really explain things the way they are with a story? Is a story enough, right? Is a story, isn't it too simple or sometimes deceptive just because we think it describes and it does not? And so is it more like bedtime stories? You know, bedtime stories, each time you read a bedtime story, you think, that doesn't make sense, right? Even it's not supposed to be realistic, but it's supposed to be reasonably consistent. And sometimes it's not consistent, but it's the way the story is. And so we go for it. So that's a question. So here you have, maybe some of you remember the famous Enron company. So Enron at the beginning of the century was an incredibly successful American company involved in energy. It was a very special company because it was groundbreaking, innovative. It was reinventing the energy sector. And nobody would quite really understand how, but the results were fantastic. And so the question was, how do they manage to create so much wealth out of an industry that doesn't seem to change that much, right? And it's at one point, the figures were so enormous that it was impacting the entire sector. So you're thinking, how's it possible that they're so creative and extract so much value from something that doesn't seem to change? And so they had phrases like creative accounting. And so a shortening for creative accounting is scam or fraud, right? and that's what it ended up being. So Enron was not brought down. You know, the boss of Enron could really talk to George W. Bush at that time, who was the sitting president at that time. So it was really someone extremely important in the United States until an internal whistleblower, shut the whole thing down. So the crazy thing is that it took an internal whistleblower. I mean, the entire Treasury Department, all the financial experts, everybody had their eyes on it. All the business analysts, the stock market analysts, everybody was looking at Enron. Nobody would see anything. You know, it was a good story. Someone said, never invest in something you don't understand, right? And at that time, only the top management of Enron would understand what they were doing. Nobody else, right? But okay, the market put billions of dollars into Enron. So again, this is, to me, this is challenging. How can you have a story that works so well when you have the entire financial establishment of the United States looking at it? I mean, it's not like it's a company somewhere in a city in Minnesota or something. It was. The guys were really sitting in front of the president of the United States, right? So it was in plain view. Creative accounting, right? How do you like that? So let's go back to the famous people who created their business out of nothing. So we started with Andrew Carnegie. Andrew Carnegie is someone extremely interesting because he's written The Gospel of Wealth, a book in which he explained that people get rich, but the money they extract from the economy is not theirs, right? They just get rich because they know how to make money, they know how to run a good business, how to create value, and then they get a ton of money, but this money belongs to the community. So once these people get older and their business is more mature, they should give back. And so Carnegie said, it's our business, us rich people, to give back. But there's a couple of things missing in this. The first thing is, he said, the only way to get rich is wild capitalism. That's the way it works. It just cannot be helped, right? So the government has nothing to do with this. It's just capitalism. And so people get poor, workers get poor, everybody who is weak doesn't benefit from anything. And the smart people who really want to go all the way for it and behave like wild animals, these guys get rich. And so because they get rich, they understand the word. They're smarter than the rest of the world. And so they need to decide what to do with the money. They need to give it back, but their own way, right? So, yeah, there's a couple of things you can criticize here. Fortunately, we've discovered that governments were not so... governments could do good things, like tax people properly and then use the money properly to help the community and develop things for the long term and these kind of things. So there's no reason why a government or the community could be so stupid that only rich people know what to do with money. So that's one thing. And there is also no reason why wild capitalism is inevitable. Right? For instance, a lot of people in Europe think if a government regulates business so that it's fair and open, right? Things are better. But the U.S. was very different at that time. For instance, you could use the army to shoot workers on strike. And so at the time when Carnegie was publishing The Gospel of Wealth, he was also agreeing with the army killing people in his own factories. Right? The U.S. Army killed workers because they were on strike, and Carnegie said, this is normal. This is perfectly normal business. At that time, if you were wealthy enough, you could buy yourself a seat at the U.S. Senate. Right? There was no central bank, and so on. So this was really the Wild West, right? But except that it was the wild United States at all, right? So okay, he got rich, but I'm not sure it's such a nice story, right? So let's move on to a more civilized United States, and let's go to the next one. So we have Donald Trump. So Donald Trump puts a lot of emphasis on the the alternative fact, that his dad had given him $1 million a long time ago, and he turned that into a fortune out of his genius. As you know, he's a genius, right? If you listen to him. So what I did is I did a slightly different thing myself, right? So it's just something I did, so I invite you to do it if you want to do it. I look at the numbers that another source gave. So it's not 1 million, it's 156 million. Okay. And then I looked at another source to evaluate his fortune right now. As you know, he's currently in court because of the evaluation of his fortune and his assets and so on. So I looked at Forbes to have an idea of his fortune right now. And then I compared that, maybe it's not the right index, but I compared that with the Dow Jones. The difference, right, if you have $156 million and you invest in a Dow Jones when he got the money, and you look at how much money you would have today, right? Interestingly, the Dow Jones has made about 8% per year over the period. So you imagine 8% per year, 8%, 1.08 multiplied by 1.08 and so on for decades, right? Because he's not that young, actually. And so what we discover is that he's beaten the Dow Jones, which, okay, he's beaten the Dow Jones. That's not so bad. But he's beaten the Dow Jones. He could have invested the money in the index, right? He could have done that, go with Vanguard or someone like that, and he would have beaten the Dow Jones probably a little bit as well. He's beaten the Dow Jones by 0.4%, right? So in other words, I don't know if you get $156 million when you got them, and instead of running a business, you just invest it, you're still a billionaire today, a multi-billionaire, right? Yeah, okay, I don't know. He didn't run his business into the ground, or at least not too many times. But, and when you run a business, it's risky. But the idea that he created his fortune out of scratch, okay, and he set a rules. The rules he's playing by is not the set of rules that you would play by, right? You, for instance, bullying business partners, tax dodging to a certain scale, and so on. Then we have Bill Gates. So Bill Gates, there's an interesting book by Malcolm Gladwell called Outliers that you want to read about that. Bill Gates is an interesting person because when he started to do business, you know, there's this story when IBM created the IBM PC, the first personal computer that was standardized. Anyone could buy that was compatible everywhere in the world, and that plenty of computer makers could use as a standard. right? So basically establishing the standard for personal computers in the 20th century, they needed an operating system, the software that makes the computer operate. And the story has it that they asked Bill Gates, who had a really small company in the middle of nowhere, and IBM was the dominant giant of the industry. So why did they do that? If you go back to that time, it's very interesting. It takes, when you're doing this, you want to talk to an expert. Becoming an expert takes 10,000 hours. 10,000 hours of deep work on your level, on your area of expertise. And so that means that when they wanted to do this, they had to go back to someone who years before, right, something like 10 years ago, decided that they would be an expert in computers and would have access to computers to do this. 10 years before the IBM PC. So at that time, the people who could make this kind of decisions on the planet were probably a handful, right? There's something like a single-digit number of people that made this decision. So understand what happened when they looked around and they said, okay, who knows about computers? Who can really create this software? They start talking to people, and they talk to plenty of people who say, I think I could do it, right? And then they talk to Bill Gates, and Bill Gates has the answer immediately to any of the questions because he has 10,000 hours. He's a geek. He's one of the first geeks. So he worked for years and years and years, day and night. He didn't sleep, he didn't take holidays or anything during the weekends and so on. He worked on computers because he was fascinated with that. So he knew exactly what he was talking about, and he was one of the very few people on Earth that could do that. And so he's who he is. And then we need to create the Microsoft operating system, the MS-DOS, the original software. And so IBM says, yes, of course, right? Go for it. We don't even know what you're talking about, right? So if you can make it and you have all the answers, go for it. And so that creates a very interesting situation. Each time you're buying a computer anywhere in the world, you're giving money to Bill Gates. Each time, because the software is his software. It's impossible to get around it. So that means that the exponential, you go from 0 PCs in the world to a PC for about everybody, right? And then several. And each time you're buying this, you're paying 10, 50, 100 euros or dollars or whatever it is to Bill Gates directly, right? And all he had to do was writing the first thing and then updating it at a meager cost, right? So it's really the lottery. He was the right person in the right place at the right time, period, right? And so I'm not saying Bill Gates is stupid, but I'm saying, of course, in this situation, you have all the time in the world to become very, very smart, right? Because, of course, you can you can surround yourself with the best consultants on earth and so on. And so you can, over the years, you can become very, very smart, right? And that's probably what he did. I'm not saying he wasn't smart at that time, but really he didn't have to, right? If on top of that he was smart, that's fantastic. Again, so much for the stories, right? You have, this is also a story if you right, admittedly, right? I'm not analyzing much. I'm just giving you very simple things, but this is just a very different version from the version you used to hear. So this idea that the government shouldn't get involved in the US. So here you have, after the subprime crisis, you have, business people saying, okay, government is the enemy. And then you have this phrase, you know, the normal phrase is, with friends like these, you don't need enemies. So here it's with enemies like Barack Obama, if you're General Motors or Chrysler, that were rescued by the American government. They didn't rescue Lehman Brothers, but they did rescue two of the big three, right? General Motors and Chrysler, because in the words of again so he made the decision and he enforced it, right? So it's bipartisan. Right? I'm not blaming anyone or praising anyone. In the midst of a financial crisis and a recession, allowing the U.S. auto industry to collapse is not a responsible course of action. And I would say even without this, allowing two of the big three going down, right? We're talking about General Motors and Chrysler. I don't believe that for a second. So they poured, I don't know, billions was the change, right? So, also here, so you know SpaceX, so an Elon Musk company. So if you look at it, you see that the first customer of SpaceX is NASA. And the second customer here is a very significant customer. It's the Department of Defense. So it's a remarkably balanced turnover, right? Half public, half private, with this being mostly acquisitions and so on. So so much for the private business does everything and so on. So we're saying, oh wow, now it's the private business that develops the conquest of Mars and the sun or whatever. Yeah, it's private business with public orders, right? So it's still the taxpayers' money. I don't know. It's a nice story, but the American government is doing what any government on earth would do if they have the money for it. There's something called DARPA, a program where the government uses billions and billions. So really, when I say billions, it's over the years, it's probably trillions, right? So to help the defense companies to develop new systems. And this system is so effective and so valuable that they're now doing it with energy, and it's called ARPA-E for energy. And again, they're the American companies that develop new systems of energy storage. You see where I'm going, because I used to have a startup in energy storage. We were competing with American companies getting hundreds of millions of dollars, billions of dollars in subsidies or grants or loans or whatever it is to develop new energy storage companies, because the government is interested in helping an industry emerge about this. So very, very similar to what happens here in France and in the European Union and China and so on. So there's nothing new. There's a story. There's an American story about the role of government, and then there's the reality. I see that time is flying, so I'm going to, I don't know, I'm probably going to simplify this a little bit. This is the S-curve, right? So when you start a business, at the beginning you don't have a lot of customers, you'll make a lot of money. And then at some point, if you're lucky and if you've done a good job, it's picking up. And customers start to appreciate what you're doing, they're buying. And so there's an exponential growth until it stabilizes once you really conquered the market and everybody has your products, and then they're just renewing it, and it's becoming like a plateau. So in today's world, a lot of businesses are like this. For instance, you develop social media or you develop something related to software. It's going to be very fast, and the end result could be a winner takes all. It means, like, for instance, if you know LinkedIn or Facebook, you don't need 2 or 3 or 4 Facebooks or LinkedIns. You just want one where everybody is. So it's a winner takes all market. So it means that here, when you're growing, you need to be the first one. If you're the second one, you disappear. There is only one company left in the end. And so one of the interesting things, if you look at some of the companies that are in this situation, is that if you want to raise money, you know, there's the company that has developed ChatGPT in artificial intelligence is OpenAI. So there's a European competitor of OpenAI that recently raised like more than 300 million euros. So it's wonderful. But if you look a little closer, you see that they raised this money in the Bay Area, right? So the European companies that are really serious contenders for OpenAI raised their money in the US. And so that's a very American thing. The American companies are routinely funded by investors and the stock market, whereas these companies would be helped a little bit by governments and funded by banks in France and in the European Union. It's very, very difficult to raise significant amounts of money from the market, from investors in Europe. You have to be almost a mature company, or at least a very convincing operating company to do that. So the thing is, American investors support companies that are making huge losses because they know in the end it's not what matters. What matters is what happens here when you're controlling the market, when you Facebook and you're making all the money and everybody else has disappeared, right? If you look at Tesla, it is the same thing. Tesla is a tech company. They're trying to define themselves as a tech company rather than an automotive company. And so they invest billions and billions in plants, in equipment, in R&D, and so on. And so, I don't know, in the 20th century, we used to call that dumping, right? When you're selling cars below cost. So here we're saying, yeah, no, but it's investment, right? You invest in R&D, you invest in, and so you're a startup, so it's normal, you invest in plenty of things, and then you're selling the cars at cost, but you don't use the figures about investment, innovation, and these kind of things. And so you're losing money, but it's not dumping because it's a startup. So of course, American investors are gutsy, right? Because they can all lose that money, right? But still, I'm not going to say it's a safe bet, but it's getting safer and safer as your position remains number one, right? So, and of course, if you're starting in the world's biggest economy, it doesn't hurt, right? It's again, the bet is a little bit safer again because of that. So again, I'm not saying that this is necessarily wrong or anything. I'm just saying if you're Elon Musk, the reason why you're succeeding might have to do with other things than just the guy's a genius. Right? It might be rooted in actual things that do happen in business. So let's get back to Elizabeth Holmes, developing a great company, a startup that is fantastic. The problem was it didn't work, right? She developed a technology that was supposed to save the world and so on, but it was fake. So again, it was a fraud, a scam, and so on. So it wasn't and it wasn't clear until it was. And she was trying, she can still claim she was trying, but she was just not succeeding. And so the story is, yeah, I had to sustain interest in my company until I succeed and so on. But the fact is, she told people she could do things that she couldn't do. So eventually it didn't work. She's in jail. The picture you saw earlier was her checking in at the tribunal for a trial. And so interestingly, she had a lot of people on her board. She had Henry Kissinger, right? Very well known for his knowledge in biology and so on. So, and she said, I think that the minute you have a backup plan, you've admitted that you're not going to succeed. So I'm not sure when I see what the situation was and is now, I'm not so sure about that. Personally, when I was running startups, I told my investors we have backup plans, right? So I don't know. Now we also have, the idea that we're thinking out of the box and so on. So I just wanted to show you this about Facebook. This is the revenues in advertisement, right? Advertisement, I mean, just like the revenues of TF1 or I don't know, any companies that's doing something in media, right? And this is the revenues of things that are related to the metaverse and so on, right? So, okay, the company is not Facebook now, it's called Meta. But what it's doing is it's targeted advertisement, I grant you that, right? They know a lot of things about people because you're interacting in the media, on Facebook, so they know you and they try to send you advertisement that works. But it's still advertisement, right? It's not the oldest business on earth, but we've been doing that for a couple of centuries now, right? So Mark Zuckerberg said in last year that our management theme for 2023 is the year of efficiency. So much for the metaverse and changing the word and so on, right? Advertisement. To conclude on this, are these stories typically American, or do they work? And so a couple of questions. So first of all, if we get back to the idea of system one, the problem we have is that Americans, when they grow up, they see this kind of things, right? This American legend. So it's something that hasn't sold in Europe because it's typically American. So these guys are all pioneers, winners, overcoming, with the new frontier and so on. And you have this recent movie that is painful to watch because she's the main character and she's deciding to do something crazy that doesn't make much sense. She's a pain in the neck for the whole movie. She's a very not sympathetic person, right? Not a likable person. And she's the hero. And she's winning in the end. And so you're thinking only Americans can watch that comfortably. I was uncomfortable for the whole movie. I was thinking, when does it end, right? Okay, she's going to win, and okay, but it's so painful to watch, right? She's insulting everybody. She's harassing everybody. One of the guys involved get cancer. You think it's because of her, and so on. So it's horrible. But Americans buy into this, right? They're thinking, hey, she's winning, right? It's a role model somehow. So I'm saying this. If you're American, you're going to tell me, okay, you're too extreme, but I think it's the reality. Your system one, if you're American, you're watching all the movies and the storytelling and the advertisement and so on. You're exposed to that constantly for decades. In the end, your intuition tells you stuff that it's normal. You have to be a winner. You have to work hard. You have all of this is part of you, right? And it takes really a huge effort from your conscious reasoning to contradict that. And the problem is not just Americans now because we're all watching this. So here, this comes from cultural dimension frameworks that we're using to understand the differences in cultures around the world. So I've just selected a few of them. One of them is low risk avoidance or high risk avoidance, right? And you see the definitions. So the Americans stand here. They don't care that much about risks. And so it's really very compatible with moonshot. So in other words, the American culture takes the moonshot very comfortably. Right? They think, okay, moonshot, it makes sense. In a lot of other cultures, people would think, oh, we can't do that. That's horrible. Individualism, okay, you understand. If you're in Japan, you're here, but in the US, it's very, very individual. So the self-made man, fine, right? Self-made man in Japan, I'm not so sure, right? That's not what people root for. Short-term orientation versus long-term orientation. Again, no government, right? Government is the long-term of a community. We don't care about that. We care about what happens right now. Achievement versus ascription, gaining success because of who you are as opposed to what you achieve, right? Of course, Americans are comfortable with that. They think they can do it, and they can go the extra mile to show you. And inner directed or outer directed, you control by your environment or you control the environment. Of course, the Americans control the environment, right? And some of them control the environment even when it's getting completely out of control. But they still think they can do it. So the pioneering thing, the idea that we're going to make it irrespective of what happens around the world, that's very American. So in other words, all these stories, there are business stories. They work very well in the American culture. A lot of people are in the other cultures. And so I'm not sure we accept these stories as easily if we're not American. But the problem is, here you have Jeff Bezos explaining this in something that sounds like a church, but he's actually in one of the Ivy League colleges on the East Coast. And so the problem is they succeed. The American, as I discussed in the last conferences, the American economy is extremely successful. American business is dominant. Right? It's not that it succeeds more than others. It is dominant. Right? And if you think China is a challenge, I think you read the news. Right? China was a challenge. So it's very easy for Americans to say, hey, it works, so we're right. Okay? Yeah? So if a story works, why would we challenge it? And so again, I hope I've shown you that you can challenge the stories. You don't have to take that for granted. Unfortunately, if you want to challenge it, it's very easy for Americans to say, hey, do you better than I do? Right? So if you don't, well, come back with better figures, and then I'll be open to debate. But right now, I'm succeeding, so my stories look good, right? And so that's difficult. The problem is it works up to a point, right? Right now, the word ecosystem is collapsing, right? It is collapsing. You can discuss, you can debate, you can disagree with me, but the reality every day is it's collapsing. The wealth distribution is not what we want it to be. It's improving, it's not improving, whatever. But the reality is people die in the streets or in Ukraine or wherever. And we have a third problem, which is the success of democracy versus autocracies or plain dictatorships. And this is not improving, right? So and it's a little remote from business, but I mean, we're not succeeding. Right? And so that's general, that's the whole word. And Americans not more than us, right? So there is a problem, right? It's not just the GDP, it's not just the bottom line and the profits of companies. So the idea that it is succeeding, and because we have only this example of success, this can actually, if we don't challenge this, if we don't accept to sit down and think, okay, does this thing really work? We might have problems. So I give you here a couple of other possibilities. So you have the French model, right? So companies that the state owns, douceur de vivre. So, but I'm joking, but the French economy is successful. It's not as successful as the American economy, but it is successful. And people work 35 hours a week here, right? It's a reality. So that's, in my view, it's a meaningful challenge, right? You can't just put it aside saying, oh no, you don't make as much money as we do. Hey, wait a second, I don't make as much money as you do, but I'm fine, you know, and you're still at work and I'm home, right? So the Mittelstand, so the family business in Germany, an example for all of us, working on several generations, right, doing business over several generations, successful business, and a business that takes care of the community. The Japanese kairetsu, so life employment, harmony in the society. So Japan is a kind of closed ecosystem, pretty much, in this respect. But there is still something into it that is worth analyzing. So the Chinese consensus was a challenge, as I said. I'm not sure you want to go down that road, but it's been successful. But admittedly, like in every economy that is growing to a consumer economy, it's successful for 30 years. I wouldn't say whatever you do, but it's successful for 30 years, and then you have to really organize your country, which is what Xi Jinping is trying to do right now, and apparently it's killing the economy. So I'm not sure they really have what it takes to do it. And then there's the Scandinavian model, right? And so I would love to talk about that for an hour, because the Scandinavian model is always, it's where you want to look, right? They do things really better than the rest of the world, whatever the metrics you're using. There's really something here. Yeah. So, bottom line, what I wanted to conclude with is this. There could be an American moment, right? There could be a reason why the U.S. has been successful most of the time over the last couple of centuries, very often. But the U.S. has got a Great Depression. The U.S. has also had very, very difficult moments, and so my question, right? It's not an answer. It's more like a question. Is could it be that the U.S. is particularly successful in the last few decades because this is the moment where we went from local economies to a more global economy. And this is a transition in the world. This is a moment where the American model is particularly adequate. So in this situation, the U.S. economy, the U.S. business, the stories, the American stories would work pretty well. And what if it changes, right? And what if, okay, we go to a different phase of globalization? Globalization is not over. It's still going on, but it's going on differently and at a different speed and in different ways. And so what if, it's the end of that moment? It could have been an American moment like there was a Japanese moment in the 70s and 80s for other reasons. And it could be a different moment, maybe, an African moment or something, right? And so when the silicon dust settles, if the Americans still believe in their stories that don't always seem to work the way they're intended to, maybe that would be a kind of painful reckoning, right? So I wouldn't. I'm extremely impressed with what the Americans have done over the last few decades, but again, it's just like the stock market, right? Past performance doesn't tell you anything about the future. So I don't know. I'm curious to see what's going to happen in the next few decades. And that's what I wanted to cover today. And so if you have any questions, after the questions, before you leave, I'll put this page on if you're interested in the books that I've used to prepare the conference.
Thank you very much for that.
You're welcome.
Broad landscape of
Thanks a lot.
American business narrative. If there are questions, I'm here with the microphone so that I can pass the microphone and we'll be happy to take your questions.
Arash, thank you.
So regarding the last point that you mentioned, it has also had its bad moments. So my question to you is, what can we learn collectively as lessons from moments in American history which have been crises or problems or issues? So for example, you mentioned the Great Depression, but also the dot-com bubble burst, the 2008 recession, the Silicon Valley Bank collapse, it happened last year. So what are the lessons we can learn from these moments of crises?
There's a frightening word that you used. You said, what can we learn collectively? And so I'm not sure we can learn anything collectively. Because if you look at the situation today in the ecosystem, this is very, very similar to the Dust Bowl that happened during the Great Depression in the United States, where the way to deal with the soil led to huge dust storms that basically made the entire Midwest useless as far as growing crops, and sent millions of Americans to the coast because they couldn't make a living where they were, and that's the grapes of wrath and all this. So we could look at this, and we could look at that in the 70s and the 80s, at the beginning of the century, not wait for today to look at this. And still what happens, well, we're just ruining the environment just the same way collectively. Right? A lot of people understand this. A lot of people theorize this. You even have people very vocal, very famous. You got Greta Thunberg one more time and so on. So people tell us what to do. But collectively, can we learn that we have a big, big problem with that? The idea of learning collectively. You have people voting right now, in Hungary, in the European Union, for crooks, right? Just the same way as Germans voted for Hitler in the 1930s, right? Hitler was elected, right? So people vote for Putin, right? So what can we learn collectively? I'm not sure we're equipped to learn collectively. I think we still have work to do. I'm an optimistic person, so I'm sure there is a solution to that, and I'm sure we can get that. We can get there ultimately. But collectively, what can we learn? Right now, I think we have a big obstacle to learn collectively. But the lessons are there. I think I'm not. If we would want to find a solution, really look at some of the American business narratives and draw lessons from the past events to see, okay, this is how really business works. That takes PhDs, right, to really do it seriously. And then we would have to explain the findings of these PhDs to people. And they would have to use their system too to make sense out of that. Almost nobody uses system 2 to analyze their political options, right? When you think, okay, who should I vote for? That's what Daniel Kahneman explains. When you think, who should I vote for? If you're really serious about this, you need to do a lot of work. You need to really read programs and think about what it means and look at the things like you're a member of a Congress to really understand what's going on. Nobody does that. People look at the candidates and they say, I like this one. And then they use story to justify that.
I think that you mentioned the Dust Bowl because Roosevelt solved that problem, but he solved that problem by developing an irrigation system for the farmers that dips into one of the biggest aquifers in the West, and which has about a 30-year lifespan from now on. So the difficulty is matching the political calendars with the long-term solutions that we need in order to have a sustainable environment. But that's just my take on the things. Can I ask any other questions in the audience? Anybody would like to make a comment? If not.
Well, that's all. It's great because it's time. But
yes, we arriving to the end of our conference. Thank you very much for coming, and thank you immensely. I think we're going to have François back
you're welcome. You're
many
very
times.
welcome.
So thank you very much.
Thanks a lot. Thanks a lot.